Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dorothy Kim, and I am one of the organizers of this iteration of Race4Race Politics. I want to welcome everyone to the last day of Race4Race Politics, and this really what I think will be a really amazing last session on race, gender, and the politics of intersectionality. We'd like to thank again all of the people who've been supportive of this conference, including Brandeis University, ASU's ACMRS, and everyone who's done the immense work of just getting everything together. So today we have three speakers, and their bios and titles are in the program, so I'm not going to get into a sort of introduction. They will go in order of the program, and they will go one after the other, and then we will hold questions for the very end. And then after the questions, we will actually have a small sort of last commentary discussion to sort of send everyone off to close out the conference. So the first speaker will be Yujhán Claros, and then we will have a talk with Jennifer L. Morgan, and the final speaker will be Stacey Murrell. So thanks again, and I will just hand it over to Yujhán.
It's a very real honor and privilege for me to contribute to Race4Race. So first, I would like to thank our hosts at ACMRS, ASU, and Brandeis University, and most especially Dorothy Kim, Leah Newsom, Sasha May Eccleston, and Daniel Padilla Peralta for their effort and support in arranging my participation. I come to you today from the ancestral land of the Ice people of Florida, myself a descendant of the Mesoamerican Lenca, as well as Africans enslaved by Spaniards in El Salvador, and furthermore as the child of refugees displaced to the land of the Lenni Lenape by imperialist practices in the United States and Central America at the end of the 20th century. I'm grateful for the opportunity publicly to repudiate the legacies of settler and exploitation colonialism that have enabled white supremacy in the Americas, and especially to honor the indigenous custodians of this sunny land where I found refuge a little over a year ago. Drawing from preliminary and concluding arguments contained in my recently completed dissertation, this essay examines the origins of racism in the so-called West by focusing at the outset on the Greek concept of genos in shaping ideologies of biological difference, first with respect to gender, and subsequently and interrelatedly with respect to ancestry, or quote genetics, and quote race. Furthermore, by recourse to art history, I demonstrate that a notional and material black-white color binary critically informs the construction of gender in the social imagination at the start of the Greek classical age. The semantics of the originally gendered black-white color binary, as we shall see, have profound ramifications in social thought from antiquity into modernity. Ultimately, in this essay, I aim to provide a concise and comprehensive analysis of the origins of racism in the so-called West, especially by calling upon the socio-political and historical claims of a cadre of women scholars of the ancient past who have argued that the combination at Athens of foundation myths involving autochthony with laws restricting citizenship to the sons of Athenian men born exclusively to women native to the polity produces a racialized citizen body during the first democratic imperial regime in the historic record. To start, I want to recognize that it is not unproblematic to translate the Greek term genos as quote race. My deployment of scare quotes is intended to signify my understanding that race is not a transhistoric concept. That withstanding, because as far back as we can track the genealogy of racial thought, it originates with discourses involving genos. It is expedient for our analytic purposes to translate genos as quote race. We can trace the meaning of the Greek word's root to Proto-Indo-European gene, to give birth, beget, with derivatives referring to aspects of and results of procreation, and to familiar and tribal groups. My apologies, I hit the space bar in the wrong document. Oh my. Although the word genos is cognate with a host of English terms, including also, of course, cognate, its usage in the Greek language, although extremely common, has a slightly more limited semantic range. Unsurprisingly, the Greek term hews more closely to the Proto-Indo-European root in conveying meanings mainly about ancestry. One notable exception to the ancestral signification mobilized by the word genos in Greek, and some might argue that this is in fact not an exception, is the lexical use of this word to represent gender, both as a projection onto the sex body and as a grammatical phenomenon. In a critical early use of the term in the Greek literary tradition, specifically in the Archaic Age poetry attributed to Hesiod, we find the genesis of gender described with the creation of Pandora as the first in a genos gunaikon, a race of women. In Greek thought, the idea that women constitute a genos discrete from men, that women are a different racial entity altogether in contrast to men, becomes firmly rooted in the, quote, biological discourses of the classical age. We shall shortly deconstruct the meaning of this racialized gender alterity by analyzing perceptions about physical difference in male and female bodies. First, however, I would like to focus on the symbolic imaginary, and specifically on elite forms in the visual arts that dominated at the end of the Archaic Age, which coincides with the approximate date for Hesiodic poetry and which contribute to the notional sense in the classical age that women constitute a racial group separate from men. The art historic claim I seek to elaborate is that by the Greek classical age, so far as we can reconstruct it visually, vis-a-vis the material and artistic remains of the so-called Black figure pottery, gender is colored in the symbolic imagination. While the classical age at Athens properly sees the efflorescence of so-called red figure ceramics, an exemplary Athenian imperial export, much like the dramatic arts of the stage, during the earlier Archaic Age, when the aesthetic and symbolic imaginary of the later classical period coalesced, as you can see from the sampling of archaic ceramics I present here, men, for the most part, were represented visually by means of black paint, and women, by contrast, through white paint. I recognize that this was not always, but indeed most often the case. During the classical age at Athens, furthermore, the vintage traditions of rendering female bodies in white endured in the Panathenaic prize amphorae, with their well-known depictions of a white-bodied Athena. Because of its misogynistic erasure of female bodies, I personally find the name Black figure demeaning. I rather refer to it as Black and white figure. At the start of the classical age, whiteness in the Greek artistic and symbolic imagination and representation of physical forms is not a feature of, quote, Europeans, but rather a genos-related or generic choice made to represent gender difference, that is, womanhood. The issue has been discussed by other scholars of antiquity. By virtue of its semantic quality, this gendering of whiteness as feminine within a black-white color binary represents the subordination of whiteness to the dominant blackness of masculinity. Because the black-white binary in the archaic and early classical Greek imagination represents a generic and discriminatory color hierarchy, I argue that the genos-related issue at hand is the origin of racial and racialized thought. Long before modernity and its handmaiden race, the notional black-white color binary that organized gender in Greek thought produced gendered, quote, race or racialized gender. While not yet race as we know it, these are the seeds of racism today. Although the fundamental elaboration of a black-white binary in Greece informs the origins of racism, women in other Mediterranean societies, most notably in Egypt, were often represented as lighter skinned than men. This is a logical consequence of domesticity and the confinement of women to the home, as well as veiling in the ancient Mediterranean. Having appreciated the colorism of gender discrimination in the Greek imagination, we return to the issue of bodies and, quote, biology. In doing this work, I depend on Brooke Holmes' Gender, Antiquity, and Its Legacy. She argues at the very start of the first chapter that the instability and fluidity in the earliest discourses on the physical body in Greek texts is indicative that the sexed body itself is the primary locus for inquiry into gender in antiquity. The chapter deconstructs the intellectual history of biological sex as early as the medical texts of the Hippocratic Corpus and Aristotle's writings on biology. Holmes situates physical, sexed bodies in the context of, quote, capital N, nature, Greek physis, the very matter and stuff of which she shows at the end of the chapter is itself gendered feminine, and elucidates the fabrication of the gender binary, which remains a familiar ontological issue in modernity, in discourses about bodies. By recourse to the Pandora myth and Hesiod, Holmes indicates aptly the genos-related othering of women by rendering her translation of genos as, quote, race, and exposing the implication that racial thought covers for more central issues about bodies and their perceived roles in, quote, nature. Motivated by a desire to expand the critical discourse concerning women in ancient Greece beyond reinscribing women as the axiomatic other, Holmes surveys the intellectual history of gender and the gender binary in order to deconstruct assumptions about the material body, both in antiquity and modernity. Furthermore, she insists upon expanding the conversation to include the role of women in society and the concepts of the political female and feminine. Holmes elaborated this work, of course, in the intellectual succession of Nicole Leroux and Susan Leip, where we find special attention given to the civic and political expectation on women to produce the Athenian genos by means of their reproductive capacities in a society that mythologized ideologies of autochthony, enshrining the idea that the Athenians had sprung from the soil of Attica itself, that they belonged to the land as much as it belonged to them. The more recent work of Rebecca Futo-Kennedy argues that immigrant women were racialized by 5th century laws restricting citizenship at Athens to sons born exclusively to native-born women, only from enfranchised men in the polity. In sum, these critical discourses elucidate the nature of civic and political gender discrimination at Athens and help us better to appreciate the function of, quote, race and racialization in early democratic politics. It is instructive to keep our attention on bodies as we explore further the conceptualization of genos. In the Greek and later Roman imaginations, the materiality of sex bodies, the fluidity and humoral quality, the liquid stuffs, is primarily how discourses of gender are organized. The binaries of hot versus cold, muscular versus soft, hard versus spongy, and dry versus wet map onto man versus woman. The moisture and perceived weakness of female and feminine bodies in the Greek medical texts especially marks an implicit pathology or deviation from the articulateness of the apparent default in the strong male body. In the Hippocratic corpus, especially in airs, waters, places, we can locate the genealogy of genos-related discrimination as always freighted with sexism as well as racism. This subject too has been examined critically in scholarly writing. In the Hippocratic anthropological system, moisture is as important to the particular manifestation of diverse gene, quote, races, as is geography and ecological or environmental thought, which in some ways is almost the equivalent of fate in the anthropologies of the relatively contemporary text of Herodotus' histories. Climates with frequent, abrupt, and violent seasonal changes were supposed to endow the peoples who inhabited them with traits and qualities not stereotypically associated with people who dwelt in temperate and stable climates. In the Egyptian Logos of Book 2, for example, Herodotus portrays the, quote, genos-related trouble that foreign bodies, especially African, Egyptian, and, quote, Libyan women from dry and arid climates posed to the Greek imagination. Never mind that there's no evidence for some of Herodotus' more shocking claims about gender reversal in Egyptian society, nor for what Hippocrates implies about people from the Anatolian Peninsula. Even more significant is the way they both treat the Scythians. Among these people who initially inhabited the Black Sea boundaries of the Eurasian steppe, Nell Irvin Painter identifies the genealogical source of, quote, white people and racial whiteness, with recourse to Herodotus Book 4 and the Hippocratic airs, waters, places. Painter's intersectional work is attuned to the sexing operative in the gendering logic of early racial thought, and no place on earth or the Greek imagination could be a better location to examine how central gender is to the formation of, quote, race and racism than Scythia, which in the classical age closely corresponded with modern-day Ukraine. The Scythian homeland is moist, a land of many rivers. Scythia also gets cold. From the Hippocratic and Herodotean perspective, Scythians are effeminate. Not only does Herodotus document there an abundance of surgical sexual reassignment as a sacral response to erectile dysfunction, he says Scythian men weigh more than their less fleshy Greek and Persian counterparts. It should not surprise us that Herodotus locates the Amazons of myth in Scythia. Here, among, quote, naturally effeminate men, women could easily dominate society. It's difficult to isolate this kind of thinking under a rubric of climate extremes in the notional northern frontier of the Greek imagination, especially when we consider what happens at the southern boundary. Representations of melanin-rich skin are not only gendered, but also complicated by ideas or ideologies of ethnic or genetic or even racial difference, predicated as they are on forms of environmental and biological determinisms that inform Greek ideas about ancestry. Herodotus expresses the ways in which the melanin-rich skin of African women reflected and inflected discourses of both gender and physical or, quote, biological difference. At a couple of moments in the histories, chiefly in books 2 and 4, Herodotus describes Africa, quote, Libya, as defined by the Sahara. Prior to the start of the Egyptian Logos, Herodotus depicts the geography of the continent as barren and wild. From the perspective of the Caireneans in Libya, he records sub-Saharan peoples have black skin, chroma melanas. Later in book 2, as Herodotus explores the legacy of, quote, Sesostris, a mythic Greek figure closely associated with the Egyptian pharaoh Senusret III, he mentions black skin and, quote, woolly hair, melanchroes kai ulo triches, as potential evidence, albeit not conclusive, of a, quote, genetic connection between Egypt and Colchis in modern-day Georgia. I propose that the blackness of Egyptian women's skin informs Herodotus' generalization about Egypt and cultural difference in book 2 at the start of the Egyptian Logos, which begins with a Greek stereotype about Egyptians. The, quote, contrariness of Egypt does not preclude it from producing and possessing ancient wisdom and knowledge. But with respect to gender, for example, Egypt provides a space of absolute disorientation for the Greek male, that is to say, Herodotean gaze. The gender difference of Egyptians, in fact, is the first and most memorable evidence that Herodotus provides of Egyptian contrariness. The gender nonconformity and subversion that Pindar inscribes at Kyrene and Pythian 9 is a comparable manifestation of, quote, gender trouble in Africa from the Greek point of view. As we saw earlier, discourses about genos are operative in the physiological writings of Hippocrates that equate environment and geography with something like biologically determined difference or racial or ancestral destiny. The manner in which these discourses are also active in Herodotus shows that genos exists on a number of salient axes, namely gender and an earlier iteration of what has evolved into modern race, a former version that wasn't tainted with universal anti-Blackness. If gender is a coextensive social construction that attends the formation of sexual difference, it is a readily comprehensible concept that genos, or, quote, race, is a phenomenon derived from the interrelation of both gender and ancestry. The semantic and representational density of this intersection is complicated by the mapping of the black-white binary onto men and women, as we saw earlier. Colors in the black-white binary especially do not mean the exact same thing to us as they did in antiquity, despite an evident traditional and critically discursive genealogy. Accordingly, I shall dedicate the remainder of my time to exploring in detail what the black-white binary signifies at 5th century imperial Athens. To do this work, I turn to philological or textual analysis. Generally, the tragedian Aeschylus and also Herodotus, the historian, are the primary classical loci for exploration of encounters between Greeks and peoples from Persia and North Africa, foreigners, xenoi, and also, quote, barbarians, non-Greek speakers, among whom black skin was common in the Hellenic imagination. The articulateness of both Egyptian and Persian, quote, blackness or black skin is ideally masculine and unproblematic in the Greek mind. The hardness of Egyptian and Persian women in Greek thought, however, poses different issues categorically. I shall focus on Aeschylean poetics because they are exemplary of imperial art in the 5th century in order to explore this black-white color binary in greater detail. From a structuralist perspective, Aeschylus embraces a binary and misogynistic metaphysics organized by gender. Consider Froma Zeitlin's visualizations of the issue in the Oresteia with some of my notes. As you might gather from the specific terms I have highlighted in Zeitlin's diagram, the logical consequence of this order would situate whiteness on the left with masculinity and blackness on the right with femininity. Aeschylus' implicit and unspoken distortion in the Oresteia of the black-white color binary, familiar from the visual arts, rewards further analytic elaboration. While I shall aim to trace Aeschylean whiteness systematically here, I shall not do so exhaustively. Still, a tour of noticeable whiteness in some of his extant works is instructive. Early already in the surviving text of the Danaid dramatic cycle, which provides an account of legendary and mythic miscegenation between Egyptian refugee women and Greeks, the suppliant's woolen fillets are white. Even earlier, however, whiteness is applied to water and moisture thematically in the words of the chorus, whose later programmatic participation in the discovery of water in the Argos myth becomes a locus of intersectional criticism in the cosmologies of Callimachus, tangentially a native-born African poet who descended from 3 centuries of Greek kings in Cyrene and Libya and immigrated to Alexandria in the 3rd century during the Hellenistic Age. The notional whiteness of our gendered suppliants in Aeschylus' earlier classical Danaids, however, their accoutrements and moisture abstractly converge clearly in the text of this play well before the Egyptian men arrive and their white garments stand in chromatic juxtaposition against their black skin. The Danaids themselves, of course, have melanin-rich skin. They describe themselves as a black, sun-struck race, melanthes heleok tupon genos. In Aeschylus' semantic choices involving the black-white binary elsewhere in his tragedies, whiteness aligns notionally and symbolically with the day, and blackness represents night. Day is white at Persei 300, in contrast to black night, and again at 384. When compared with the linguistic evidence from the Oresteia, it seems almost idiomatic that day is white and night is black in Aeschylus' diction. Toward the end of the Oresteia, when the Furies' clothing is described in Humanities, it is black and explicitly not white. This is appropriate in the symbolic scheme that aligns Clytemnestra, a gender-subversive husband-slaying wife, and womanhood with primordial and chthonic darkness, a logical function of the structural misogyny so well documented in the feminist criticism at the end of the 20th century. There is a real cognitive problem here, however, because if Clytemnestra's body were to be imagined predictably in the vintage elite style, her skin would most likely be imagined as white. The racialized color hierarchy of gender in the Greek symbolic and artistic imagination is shaken by cognitive dissonance that I refuse to believe alluded to Aeschylus. In his institutionally patriarchal and misogynistic society, where the normative confinement of women to domestic spaces and the veiling of ladies in public ensured that they remained relatively pale and vitamin D deficient, and too often socially invisible also, in contrast to men, the whiteness of women's skin relative to the blackness of men's skin is symbolically uncontested. Aeschylus' metaphysics and cosmos express binary categorically, but inscribe an awareness of the cognitive dissonance that surrounds the semantic distortion in the meaning of color. Aeschylus stages an imaginary opposition that becomes a site of controversy or conflict. The drama is obviously gendered and racial, and yet its full implications remain unspoken in the text, and until now, I propose, they remain unanalyzed. As Aeschylus absorbs the physical theory of, quote, nature, he enforces misogyny and gender discrimination, a color-based hierarchy of genos, indeed an early form of racism in his art. This is only possible through an obvious semantic distortion and an unspeakable logical inversion in the racialized color semantics of gender dynamics. Before I make the issue explicit by returning to Clytemnestra and the Oresteia, it's worth exploring a bit more how whiteness provides additional gendered meaning in Aeschylus' work. The substitution of moisture for femininity imports a gendered and frankly fully sexualized meaning to the whiteness of milk at Persei 665. Precisely because whiteness appears in the fragments of Aeschylus at least twice to describe sacrificial pigs, ostensibly substitutes for virgin sacrifices, It is also reasonable to deduce that whiteness symbolizes a notional virginal purity in the Greek imagination. These semantics are complicated tangentially by the artistic innovations of Pheidias in visual media and plastic arts, which are largely responsible for the divinization of whiteness in the classical Greek imagination. More important than Pheidias' choice of stone that would gleam from the temple at the sacred top of the Acropolis, his crucifixine statues of Athena Parthenos and Zeus at Olympia contributed to the notional whitening of the Greek imagination of their gods, both male and female. Their skin, as represented by the Picasso or Warhol of Aeschylus' own day, was as light as ivory. The absence of the categorically feminine white purity in Aeschylus' representation of Clytemnestra in the Oresteia betrays the unspeakable racial substitution implied by the darkness of Clytemnestra and the blackness of the Furies' robes. This complicated treatment of the black-white color binary and gender binaries in Aeschylus' artistic practice proves influential, as we can see when we consider how Euripides proliferates ideologies of racialized gender, especially in the Medea and Helen. The first chapter of Feroz Vasunia's The Gift of the Nile, Hellenizing Egypt from Aeschylus to Alexander, essentially a systematic study of Egypt in the classical Greek imagination, contains an analysis of racial color and tragedy, exploring in detail how Aeschylus in the Danaids and Euripides in the Helen racialize whiteness and blackness vis-a-vis gender. In what follows, I quote Vasunia's argument to juxtapose it ultimately with Toni Morrison's definition of Africanism in one of the seminal applications of critical race theory to English literary study. The stereotype of Egypt as the land of the dead is one of the oldest connected with that culture. One big undertaker's emporium is what Rudyard Kipling called it. The Greek discourse on Egypt exploits this idea ruthlessly in drama, where issues of erotics, desire, and race are configured in relation to death. Aeschylus and Euripides bring together death, sex, Egypt, Black men, and potential rape in Suppliants and Helen, respectively. In both plays, it is Greek men who intervene to save the lives and the chastity of Greek women from the threatening clutches of Egyptian men. The context for their actions is the blackness of Egyptian men in Suppliants, the underworld coloring of Egypt in Helen, and the pervasive association between blackness and death in the Greek imagination. These plays, therefore, give a peculiar and forceful direction to the hoary, if vague correlation between the Orient and sex. And the plays clearly signal that Greek women detest sexual relations with the deathly and deadly Black men of Egypt. Helen and the suppliant women would sooner die than have sexual intercourse with hypervirile Egyptian males. Suppliants and Helen give the Athenian male a space for self-definition and a stage on which to tame the threatening other. The Athenians construct this phantasmatic other to disguise the relations between Greek men and women and between Greeks and foreigners in their own city-state, with its mask of a democratic society. The fantasy substitutes for the real and defers confrontation with it. The real itself is too painful to describe because its revelation would expose the fraudulence of the political fictions the city tells itself. It is instructive to compare Vasunia's analysis with Morrison's work in Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination, where she critiqued the representation of Africanism in literature produced by white Americans in the 20th century. In the third and final essay or chapter of the book, titled Disturbing Nurses and the Kindness of Sharks, Morrison analyzes the work of Hemingway and elaborates a complex argument that shows how Black male and female nurses, figures of vexing gender subversion for the white male author, occupy an instrumental function throughout his written corpus. The genealogical continuities and distortions of the ancient Black-white binary are remarkable. Africanism is the vehicle by which the American self knows itself as not enslaved, but free, not repulsive, but desirable, not helpless, but licensed and powerful, not historyless, but historical, not damned, but innocent, not a blind accident of evolution, but a progressive fulfillment of destiny. It serves as a marker and vehicle for illegal sexuality, fear of madness, expulsion, and self-loathing. Africanism is inextricable from the definition of Americanness. The literature of the United States, like its history, represents commentary on the transformation of biological, ideological, and metaphysical concepts of racial difference. But the literature has an additional concern in subject matter. the private imagination interacting with the external world it inhabits. Literature redistributes and mutates in figurative language the social conventions of Africanism. In minstrelsy, a layer of Blackness applied to a white face releases it from law, just as entertainers, through or by association with blackface, could render permissible topics that otherwise would have been taboo. So American writers were able to employ or imagine Africanist persona to articulate and imaginatively act out the forbidden in American culture. Some of the common linguistic strategies employed in fiction to engage the serious consequences of Blacks include fetishization. This is especially useful in evoking erotic fears or desire and establishing fixed and major differences where difference does not exist or is minimal. Blood, for example, is a pervasive fetish. Black blood, white blood, the purity of blood, the purity of white female sexuality, the pollution of African blood and sex. Fetishization is a strategy often used to assert the categorical absolutism of civilization and savagery. Africanism, the fetishizing of color, the transference of Blackness, of the power of illicit sexuality, chaos, madness, impropriety, anarchy, strangeness, and helpless, hapless desire, provides a formidable field for a novel that works out the terms and maps a complete, if never formalized, aesthetics. Because of time constraints, I shall not read out Morrison's analysis of Black male and female nurse figures in Hemingway, but I leave it here for you to consider with my emphases as I close. I do not either have the time to provide a detailed synthesis of Morrison and Vesunia's criticisms. I hope that the comparison proves fruitful as it stands, however, in indicating the implications and ramifications of the genealogical continuities and distortions affected throughout the ages by the weaponization of the imaginary or notional Black, white, and man-woman binaries. Because these social fabrications have cast their cultural spells on us, primarily through language and art, albeit in their historically specific forms, scholars of literature and culture, I believe, are best suited to dismantle these oppressive structures through study of the genealogies of language and ideology that have shaped the male-dominated and white supremacist world throughout modernity. I take it for granted, of course, as I assume all of you do, that this work must be interdisciplinary and intersectional. It is possible to deconstruct this way of viewing the world, even if it demands a full frontal intellectual assault against the violent epistemic regimes that have until too recently confined and constrained our modern and contemporary imaginations, especially with regard to, quote, classical antiquity. It is encouraging and inspiring, and I am profoundly grateful to be a part of this community as it works to reimagine a bold, new, radically inclusive future for the collective human intellectual and cultural inheritance that belongs to us all. Thank you.
All right, do I just begin now, Dorothy? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much to everybody who is here. And I'll begin by saying that I come to you from New York City and acknowledge that my institution, New York University, is located in ancestral Lenape homelands. I recognize the longstanding significance of these lands for Lenape nations, both past and present, and I recognize also that historical awareness of Indigenous exclusion and erasure is critically important. I'd also like to echo Yujhán's thanks to all of the organizers of Race Before Race, and just start by saying how grateful I am to be in conversation with and learning from so many interesting scholars. So it's also unusual for me to be, I feel like I'm presenting on like 2022 or something that's so contemporary, even though compared with the work that we just heard, even though my work really starts in the 15th century, but it feels outlandishly modern right now. So I hope that it will resonate in this conversation on this panel. In my forthcoming book, Reckoning with Slavery, Gender, Kinship, and Capitalism in the Early Black Atlantic, I repeatedly reference an episode from the 1453 Chronicles of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea, written by the Portuguese chronicler Gomes de Zoraida. While the manuscript circulated only minimally in the 15th century, it wasn't discovered and published widely until the 19th century. I find it to be a really compelling window onto how Portuguese courtiers and sailors, and presumably the elite readers who Zurara anticipated to be his audience, understood the emerging phenomenon of racial slavery. For those of you who had the opportunity to watch the conversation between Ayanna Thompson and Ibram Kendi, as well as the other members of the Race4Race board, you'll see that Zurara is a pivotal figure for Kendi and for others. Indeed, Cord Whitaker focused on precisely the incident in the Chronicles that is so important to my own work in that conversation. And while I agree with Professor Whitaker that the passage represents a kind of fulcrum in a shift from a church-based hegemony to a New World colonialism, I want to emphasize the particulars of what happens in that passage, because I believe it speaks directly to the questions that are at the heart of the matter, both for me as a scholar of the early modern Atlantic world and as somebody profoundly invested in connecting the reiterative anti-Black violence of today with its origins. So despite being well-versed in the business of slavery, as any Iberian associated with the royal court would have been in the 15th century, Zurara lingers rather intently on the inherent violence done to families by merchants' value systems when he wrote of the arrival in Portugal of the first slave ship from Africa in 1444. His texts attempted to capture the grief of the 250 African captives who were unloaded on the docks of Lagos, Portugal. And I apologize for not having screen sharing, et cetera. I'm just going to read these quotes and hopefully we can, I'm just not very savvy. So Zurara wrote, quote, "Though we could not understand the words of their language, the sound of it right well accorded with the measure of their sadness. But to increase their suffering still more, there now arrived those who had charge of the division of the captives, and who began to separate one from another in order to make an equal partition. And then was it needful to part fathers from sons, husbands from wives, brothers from brothers. The mothers clasped their other children in their arms and threw themselves flat on the ground with them, receiving blows with little pity for their own flesh, if only they might not be torn from them," close quote. So Zurara's language here, the language of division, of equal partitions, in contrast to fathers, mothers, sons, and wives, conveys hereditary enslavement's essential conflict, that between market and kin. It marks the essence of what is at the root of the transatlantic slave trade and that which follows in its wake. In the starkest possible terms, we see in this passage the challenge human cargo posed for Europeans: how to bring the logics of commerce to bear on the affective space of kinship. This is, of course, a recurring aspect of slavery in the Atlantic world, one that we see reverberating in plantations, urban work sites, and households, wherever the demand of labor clashed with the ties of kin. For Zurara, the pathos of enslavement was best evoked by the contrast between the rationality of dividing up merchandise for distribution and a woman's willingness to sacrifice herself in an effort to protect her child. Now, the ties of family that connected these particular men, women, and children were explicit and specific. This particular group of captives had been captured in raids from a small geographical area, and thus they shared connections, obvious connections, even to those who were observing from a cultural and a linguistic distance. So their efforts to interrupt their commodification by refusing to remain categorized in equal partitions instead of as fathers or sons or wives or husbands were clear to Zurara and to the Portuguese customers gathered at the dock. More than that, they also exemplified what we can now see as a foundational refusal or a counter-narrative of commodification among the enslaved. Here, in that refusal of the logics of commerce, we see a conceptual space where we might imagine the roots of dissent. the nascent articulation of what would become a diasporic theory of resistance, a recognition on the part of the enslaved that the marketing of their bodies was nothing less than a systematic effort to render them kinless, to deny their kinship ties, and it was an effort that needed to be refused. So the captives' refusal to comply with the logics of the marketplace emerged as a fundamental problem in the context of an enslavement that came to rest on a hereditary mark, because of course, the market depended on kinship even as it refused it. The logic that produced women and men as commodities to be traded was based on a spurious claim to hereditary enslavability, and yet it also rendered kin ties as an obstacle to the fungibility of the market. Thus, the enslaved mother was simultaneously made impossible as the child was wrenched from her grasp, and crucial as her womb marked the child as a product legitimately offered onto the Atlantic market. It is that recurring rupture and suture of the parental bond by the invasion of commerce that defined the circuit of human commodity production in the marketplace of hereditary racial slavery. So Zorata's engagement with the pathos of this moment of sale should not be understood as a gesture of refusal. Indeed, elsewhere in his Chronicles, he mobilized kin ties among captives for very different reasons. He wrote of a community along the Senegal River that was trying to evacuate in the face of encroaching Portuguese sailors. He wrote, quote, "And the Moors rising up about dawn had sight of the sailors when they were coming, and like men without heart and deprived of hope, they began to fly, every one where he perceived he could best take refuge, leaving behind goods, wives, and children, as men who perceived that they had quite enough to do to save their own lives," close quote. Here in the evoking of abandoned kin ties, Zorata was creating a complicated moral economy in which abandoning children and mothers signified that if African men did not actually value their own communities. The claim that the parental and communal bonds dissolved easily in the face of men's desire to save themselves seems to establish for the reader that Africans were not of the same moral community as the Portuguese. Ultimately, of course, if we pull back, the entire chronicle testifies mostly to the importance of capturing Africans over all else. Zorata does not linger in these moments of pathos, except, as I will try to argue, as a way to mark all other Africans as commodities. So Zorata writes, quote, "I cannot behold the arrival of these ships with the novelty of the gain of those slaves before the face of our prince without finding some delight in the same. For it seems that I behold before my eyes that pleasure of his, O holy prince, may we not think that you felt joy, not so much for the number of the captives taken, as for the hope you did conceive of the others you could take," close quote. The joy of the prince here is the overriding principle, and the small number of captured Africans, men and women, boys and girls, should be taken as a sign of much more to come. So after the discussion of parental abandonment of the men fleeing the village, Zorata wrote of sailors who came across a woman and her children, whom they tried to subdue and take on board. Her strength at resisting her assailants surprised them, until the three men who had failed to force her into the boat realized that they could simply, quote, "take her son from her and carry him to the boat," and love of the child compelled the mother to follow after it, close quote. Only then did they capture her. The kinship between this mother and child saturates this story, and yet for both the men who enticed her and the writer who told of her, that kinship is quickly sublimated to the larger goal of obtaining captives for the joy of the prince. And so let us return to Zorata's description of the agony caused by the callous separation of mothers from children and brothers from brothers as captives were divided into parcels and distributed among the ship's investors. This is, I argue, a foundational moment of sale. It evinces the profound violence involved in rendering human beings into commodities, a violence witnessed and described in the full light of day by Portuguese observers. Yet elsewhere, in the passages describing the mother's capture, one is struck by the functionality of the connection between the woman and her child, the usefulness of that connection for catching her. In the face of the prince's joy and the myriad descriptions in the text of capture unmitigated by the anguish at finding maternal love weaponized, her agony at seeing her child taken onto a strange ship and her willingness to place herself in danger in an effort to protect him take on a decidedly ephemeral quality. But both the functionality of her kin ties and the pathos of those on the dock at Lagos are mobilized to the same end, to mark an exception in the production of the business of the slave trade as simply, to mark an exception in the broader production of the business of the slave trade as simply the exchange of commodities for currency. So there are two things that I find instructive and important about these episodes from the 15th century. One is that they reflect the fact that from the onset of the slave trade, observers recognized that the moment of sale conveyed an awful power, one not just opposed to social connection and kinship, but one whose logics effectively set out to destroy them. Second is that the efforts of the enslaved to interrupt commercial logic through kinship are as old as the slave trade itself. As they refused their commodification, captives fruitlessly struggled to force buyers and sellers to recognize the destruction wrought by the moment of sale. Sale and capture then were originary moments in the destabilization of and violent disregard for Black family life, but they were also spaces of profound refusal of that disregard. As a quick aside, I want to note that in our symbolic registers, the sales of enslaved people have often been rendered as moments of stillness and pathos, rather than as a dynamic moment rich in productive violence. And I elaborate on this more in the book, but the notion of the auction block as a symbol of the slave sale stands as a persistent and powerful symbolic image in the history of slave life. Through it, pathos, violence, and subjection get attached to a silent, waiting, scrutinized body. Fixed by the gaze of the consumer, tallied and divided, Black life on display and on offer becomes exemplified by a figure of passivity and stasis. That stasis situates the objects for sale as still and dispassionate and demarcates the moment of sale as void of compassion or connection across this gulf of economic transaction. It's an abolitionist moment. It's a moment that's critical of the process of slave sale. And yet, I think it hides the productive instance out of which sales were constructed. And it renders the processes of the market invisible as it condenses the movement and decisions of all those involved into a single still moment in time. So I argue instead that the infinite and indeed countless numbers of sales that are sales, S-A-L-E-S, that are the Black Atlantic added up to a theater of sorts. They constitute what the theorist Imani Perry would call performances of non-recognition, in which those who possessed legal personhood demarcated it through their reiterative entry into the marketplace for non-persons, and in which those deemed kinless demanded recognition of their kinfulness. So as scholars ruminate on the relationship between the emergence of race and racism as a tool to rationalize the reliance of slavery, the reliance on slavery in the Americas, the ways in which enslaved people understood the connection between the market and what I'm calling kinfulness sometimes falls to the wayside. I don't have time here to discuss the legal framework of property rights that gets transferred from Europe to the Americas, though I can discuss those later if there should be interest. But what I want to emphasize here is that the interplay between kinship and the marketplace provoked both the kind of agonized refusals and acquiescences that we see at the Senegal River and the docks of Lagos, and more formal refusals taken up by the enslaved in the Americas in the form of legal and religious petitions to courts, to legislative bodies, and to churches well before the end of the 17th centuries. In the very limited spaces where marginally free Africans were able to maneuver in, for example, 17th century New York and Virginia, the courts became a vehicle through which some were able to oppose the property claims that were rooted in the way that race would sever their familial connections to their own children. And again, I can open this up further if you want, but there's a whole discussion about the ways in which petitions and freedom papers and the searching for indenture or apprentices for children were a way to transfer property rights in children from white owners to Black parents or guardians as these actors, as people of African descent in the Americas grappled with the reach of the marketplace into their family lives. And they did so even outside of the context of fully developed slave societies, meaning that they understood dangers that emerged from communities that historians have characterized as fluid, or these kind of pre-racial spaces in which Africans and persons of African descent occupied a middle ground. The understanding of that moment for Black people in the Atlantic as being marked by Atlantic Creoles. And I'm very indebted, as we all are, to Ira Berlin's formulation here. But that emphasis usually shifts into a kind of understanding that in this fluidity, people of African descent were able to kind of move in and out of categories of property ownership and wealth and autonomy in environments that were allegedly not steeped in the clear hierarchies of white over Black. But what I argue is that the use of the courts to protect children, children who were understood by their parents as being free, is an act of recognition. It's an act of critical engagement and a theorizing of power on the part of these people of African descent in the Atlantic world that tells us, or that should tell us, that they very clearly understood the dangers of racialized hierarchies, even in this early period, prior to a kind of turn to a fully fledged slave societies in Virginia or South Carolina or elsewhere in the Atlantic world. So to return to my formal comments here, so when Atlantic Creoles used the courts to try to protect children, they did so well before a turn from labor systems that relied on indentured servants to ones that primarily exploited the labor of the enslaved. And thus, their actions reflect a comprehension regarding the dangers of their situation that significantly preceded the moment at which they would have been embedded in a widespread landscape of racial slavery. This is something that I have mobilized elsewhere to characterize women's lives in the 17th century English Atlantic and to characterize them as early theorists of power. But arguably, that formulation needs to be pushed back at least 200 years to the women clutching their children to their bodies on the dock of the Portuguese coast. Perhaps this is obvious, but to state it plainly, kinship was not dismantled under hereditary racial slavery, despite the best efforts of the marketplace to do so. Rather, kinship was resituated, was reconstituted, and of course, rendered deeply vulnerable by damages wrought by the market in human commodities. So I have one more source description to talk through as I think out loud about this business of kinship. So in 1682, the Frenchman Jean Barbeau published an account of the time he spent trading slaves along the Gold Coast near Cape Coast Castle in present-day Ghana. His description of an African family provokes an engagement with kinship both disrupted and reconstituted under slavery. He wrote, quote, "Among my several runs along that coast, I happened to have aboard a whole family, man, wife, 3 young boys, and a girl, bought one after another at several places, and cannot but observe here what mighty satisfaction those poor creatures expressed to be so come together again, though in bondage." The circumstances that tore this family apart, exposing them individually to sail along the coast, are lost to us. But even in the context of a self-congratulatory narrative of his own largesse, Barbeau's description of their satisfaction at being reunited highlights the depths of what they had believed to be their loss. In the journal entry that is the backbone of this story, Barbeau noted the purchase of a pregnant woman in the morning, a little boy and a little girl in the afternoon. A father had been purchased several days earlier. All of these people are indicated in his journal. Barbeau watched what he characterized as their tender reunion, describing the tears of happiness in their continual, quote, embracing and caressing of one another, close quote. And he rewarded them and himself with the order that, quote, "they should be better treated aboard than commonly we can afford to," close quote. He added this comment on his treatment of them on board to the later edition of his writings, having presumably reflected further on how the story might influence his reputation for generosity and humanity. The family, in any case, thus endured the Atlantic crossing together, and one can only speculate as to how they processed this good fortune. Their anomalous situation might, in fact, have only highlighted their terror. Barbeau understood that the traffic in human beings continually dissolved families, and thus he situated this particular family as if they were singular in order to imply that other captives were commodities with no familial ties. We must be fully attentive to this sleight of hand as we consider the way that kinship erupts from the archive of slavery and capitalism. Quote, "I did not care to separate them when I reached the islands, and I sold them to a single master," close quote, Barbeau wrote. In the later edition of his narrative, Barbeau again elaborates on his own humanity, adding that selling them as a group had garnered a lower price than he would have received had he sold them individually. He framed this with the information that he had, quote, "been informed of a gentleman's good nature and took his word that he would use that family as well as their circumstances would permit and settle them in some part by themselves," close quote. The overlay of the market on the affective ties of those buying and selling human beings within it should not be seen as anomalous. Rather, the self-congratulatory tone that situates Barbeau and this Martinican gentleman in opposition to the slave market, even as they are embedded in it, reflects a tool of racial domination. As this family and many others would come to understand, exceptional Black people were mobilized as proof that the majority of Black people deserved enslavement and brutality. This became a technology of this system of racial slavery that both mobilized and disavowed the family as an institution among the enslaved. So the relationship of this unnamed wife and mother to her children and their father became embedded in their exchange value on the market, which was made manifest to her in the instant, I would argue, that she caught a glimpse of her children being loaded on board that ship at anchor off Cape Coast Castle. Affect and economy were inextricable in her and her family's experience on that slave ship and in the value assigned to its members as a group. If they survived their subsequent enslavement in Martinique and the birth of the child that she was pregnant with across the Atlantic, the mother and the father would have retrospectively understood at the very least the role their kin ties had played in maintaining their proximity to one another. They would have also discerned that being together as a family made them very vulnerable. Because of the intersections of property law, nascent racial formations, and kinship, the reach of the market into family was palpable. The wide-ranging experiences of being sold clarified to African men, women, and children the ways in which their value rested on the quite tangible logics of exchange. To be sold was, of course, just the beginning of the long lesson of subjugation. But it was a lesson whose contours reflect much about the simultaneity of imposed kinship, of imposed kinlessness of kinship, and of racialized thinking. In the context of an emerging labor system in which unfreedom and hereditary enslavability were collapsing onto racialized persons, abstract notions of property and valuation were having extraordinarily material consequences for people who were African and who were rendered Black and enslavable by the marketplace. For scholars attentive to the unfolding of early modern racial capitalism, then, thinking through the intersecting logics of sale and kinlessness and the analytic impact that had on the enslaved becomes, I believe, a method by which we can apprehend that process. Thank you.
So first, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, for persevering after many, many months of changes and adaptations. I'm very glad to be here, and thank you also to my wonderful panelists. I'm speaking to you today from Barcelona, Spain, but I want to acknowledge that my home institution, Brown University, is situated on stolen indigenous lands that are the traditional homelands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it is an important social justice and decolonial practice. Brown University is also a campus that drew its early lifeblood from the African slave trade in the Americas, and several buildings there were constructed by enslaved people. While acknowledgement of this anti-Black past is not enough, it is an important aspect of the struggle for reparations. We were two separate societies divided by color until a king fell in love with one of us. Look at everything it is doing for us, allowing us to become. Love, your grace, conquers all. This is the heartfelt claim made by Lady Danbury to the Duke of Hastings, central Black characters in Netflix's Bridgerton. This statement is perhaps the only direct engagement with race in the entire 8 episodes of the first season, and understandably, it leaves much to be desired. Platitudes about love conquering all are ultimately dull weapons in the war against white supremacy, whose violence is both physical and mental, both obvious and insidious. The uneasy coexistence of fantasy and historical reality that characterizes Bridgerton trades in a critical examination of race thinking and race relations within Regency society for lavish scenes filled with Black actors, few of whom actually have speaking roles and whose character development is comparatively lacking. But viewers seeking comfort in the midst of several ongoing pandemics, anti-Black racism, white supremacist violence against Black, Indigenous, and people of color, COVID, have devoured Bridgerton en masse, making it the 5th most viewed show in Netflix's history. Much like university programs that emphasize diversity, equity, inclusion in place of social justice, abolitionist pedagogies, divestment from various forms of policing, and real accountability, Bridgerton subtly advocates for complacency. If Black people are visibly included, it can be downplayed that they do not speak. But why am I, a historian of medieval Iberia, talking about a modern show set in early 19th century England? Because the conduit by which Blackness is introduced into the British monarchy is a figure I studied in my dissertation. She is a 13th century Portuguese concubine, variously known as Oruana, Madragana, and Maior. None of these names appear in the sources, but for the sake of ease and personal preference, I will refer to her as Madragana for the remainder of this talk. Just as Bridgerton problematizes the issue of race in the relationship between past and present, I will show that Madragana calls attention to the accretions of race thinking in worlds pre-modern and modern. Together, Bridgerton and Madragana raise questions about Blackness and structures of power and authority, both in terms of monarchy and the institutions where knowledge is produced. Many viewers of Bridgerton have asked themselves, was Queen Charlotte really Black? And one could imagine asking the same question of Madragana. But this question is bound up with centuries of congealed ideology about race, recalling the late medieval and early modern concept of pureza de sangre, or blood purity, and the more modern one, drop rule. and belies the complexity of race and race thinking in the Middle Ages itself. In the following presentation, I will instead address two different questions. First, what evidence do the historical sources offer about Madre Ghana? Second, what do these sources reveal about the fault lines of medieval, early modern, and modern ideas about race? I will then discuss the ways in which these fault lines are connected to my experience as a Black woman conducting research in Spain. I first want to consider Madre Ghana as she is discussed in the present. A cursory web search, whether conducted in English, Spanish, or Portuguese, will turn up a series of blog posts, articles, and even Wikipedia pages that often link Madre Ghana to Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, her German descendant 15 generations removed. One historian, Mario de Valdez y Cocom, is at the center of almost each and every, regardless of language. And one of the most common quotes is that, quote, at least 492 lines of descent can be traced from Queen Charlotte through her triple ancestry from Margarita de Castro y Sousa to Martino Alfonso de Sousa Chichorro, the illegitimate son of King Alfonso of Portugal and his Moorish mistress, Oruana Madre Ghana, end quote. This word, Moorish, is one I want you to pay attention to, as I will return to it several times in this talk. De Valdez y Cocom's assertion dates back to at least 1997, and in nearly every article published since, a very real concern is expressed about the relationship between Blackness and monarchy. If Charlotte was, and here I'm quoting, mulatto, what does that mean for the current queen and the royal family more broadly? Unsurprisingly, plenty of skepticism is raised by journalists about the proximity of Blackness to European monarchy, most often as dismissal of the distance between Madre Ghana and Charlotte. One instance of this merits quoting in full, for it is representative of a larger trend. Quote, in any case, all European royal families somewhere are linked to the kings of Castile. There's a lot of Moorish blood in the Portuguese royal family, and it has diffused over the rest of Europe. The question is, who cares, end quote. There it is again, Moorish. There's also a collapsing of the medieval reality, the near equation of Castilla with Portugal, but the power of the statement lies in its construction of the medieval past as so remote that it couldn't possibly matter in the present. This couldn't be further from the truth. But first, the medieval evidence for Madre Ghana. I will give a general sketch of the information available before discussing the sources in more detail. As a concubine of Alfonso III of Portugal, who ruled from 1248 to 1279, Madre Ghana was one of 9 women whom the king maintained a sexual relationship outside of marriage. Contemporary nobleman and opponent to Alfonso's rule, João Ju, described the king as a man of many passions who, quote, bent his thighs indignantly to women from different sects, end quote, and he asserts that a Mora was the mother of the bastard Martim Alfonso Chichorro, and that Alfonso also had a relationship with an unnamed Jewish woman. Aside from this rather offhand comment, there are, to my knowledge, no contemporary documents in which Madre Ghana appears, whether in Latin, Arabic, or early vernacular languages. Like almost all medieval concubinal relationships in the Iberian Peninsula, there are no extant documents, if they ever existed, that detail how their relationship came about, nor how long it lasted. The remainder of the documents available for the study of Madre Ghana were produced over a span of 700 years, reaching all the way into the 19th century. She's never once named. On the basis of those sources, I can say that a woman referred to as a Mora, who possibly originated from Faro in southwestern Portugal, had a sexual relationship with Alfonso III in the 19th century and was the mother of 1 or 2 of his children, Martim Alfonso Chichorro, who appears in the documents of his father and half-brother, and Urraca Alfonso, whose 2 marriages to other Portuguese nobles are recorded. What then, you might be asking, does this nameless concubine have to do with pre-modern or modern race? To answer this question, I will focus in on the word that most often accompanies Madre Ghana, Mora. Often translated in English as Moor, it is a word with complex meanings, both medieval and modern, and one which reveals broader trends in the subfield of medieval Iberian studies. In this section of my talk, I will discuss how the various uses of the words Mora and Morisca are suggestive of race thinking. Race, as Cord Whitaker has argued, quote, sets one group of people identifiable by some distinctive trait and sets them beside another group with a different iteration of that trait. in order to make a point about hierarchy, end quote. This process can work as much through language as it does through visual apprehension. In the case of this 13th century concubine, all I have available are texts written over the span of 700 years in which the same individual appears. I follow the various refractions of this individual in order to understand what those invested in the institution of monarchy saw as the proper relationship between monarchy and moralness. In other words, I chart the ways in which these noble and royal chroniclers thought with a mora, and how that thinking changed over time. Madre Gana's next appearances in the historical record date to the late 13th and mid 14th centuries, when she is identified as simply a nameless mora in 3 works of noble genealogy listed up here, lacking a name and identifiable only by membership in a religious group, or what Geraldine Hang might call a racial religious formation. Madre Gana is set apart from the named Christian noble concubines of the same king, making it obvious that she is of a lower social status. The invocation of the word mora is sufficiently signifying that historian Francois Soyer reduces her to simply, quote, a Muslim slave woman, end quote. Pamela Patton has recently argued that the 13th century was a time when unfree status came to be tied to Blackness in the visual language of the Iberian world. Taken together, there is at least some possibility that the unfree and Black dimensions of the word mora may have been salient in the earliest descriptions of Madre Gana. There is no mention of her again until over 200 years later in the work of 2 royal chroniclers, Duarte Nunez de Leal, a lawyer and grammarian working in the late 1590s and early 1600s, and Antonio Brandão, a Cistercian monk active a few decades later. Nunez de Leal relates that the king, quote, had by a Morisca woman another child outside of matrimony named Martima Alfonso Chichorro, from whom were descended the Fidalgos of the same name, end quote. Only a few decades later, Brandão's chronicle follows Nunez de Leal, and he states that, quote, when it comes to Mora, who was Martín mother, she is the daughter of Alejandro, one of the 2 alcaides of Faro when it was won by the king, end quote. And it should be noted here that Mora lacks the definitive article, an ambiguity suggesting an individual name rather than a group that I will return to later in this talk. Brandão goes on to say that, quote, she, being endowed with great beauty, the king took love with her, although we cannot assure you the certainty of this, end quote. The introduction of the category Morisca implies either that Madre Gana herself converted to Christianity, or that she is the currently Christian descendant of a converted Muslim ancestor at unknown remove to her. If Madre Gana were indeed the daughter of an alcaide or a governor, this conversion narrative could certainly be plausible. But together, by making of her a noble and a Christian, and thus more closely resembling the descriptions used for Alfonso's other concubines, it seems more likely to be an invention of the chroniclers in order to erase an instance of miscegenation and assert a real or fictional distance from the status of full Muslim and or slave and or Blackness. The 16th century was, of course, a different climate than the 13th and 14th, and this certainly informed Madre Gana's changing depiction. The 16th century was characterized by an explosion in the African slave trade and shifts toward a more biological form of race thinking. 200 years later, the 18th century genealogy, listed here, by another nobleman, Antonio Caetano de Sousa, states that while there has been disagreement about this issue, Martim Alfonso and Urraca Alfonso have different mothers, and that the former was simply the son of, quote, a concubine, Barragao, whereas Urraca Alfonso was the daughter of, quote, a Mora, but that it matters very little because she was a Mora of very noble lineage, being the daughter of the alcaide of Faro, unquote, end quote. The repetition of her nobility suggests that from the perspective of those close to the monarchy, a sexual relationship between a king and someone of low status, i.e. a slave, was undesirable. But the denial of Madre Gana's motherhood to the founder of a dynasty of nobles who were active and influential in the intervening period suggests that in the 18th century, it was not sufficient enough to overcome Moraness as then inflected. A biological connection to current nobility and royalty had to be removed, indicative of a significantly more calcified form of race thinking, in which biology was supreme. The last source considered here, a 19th century genealogy, authored by nobleman Manuel José Acosta Felgueiras Gayu, argues instead that Urraca and Martin's mother was most likely Mos Arab. Mos Arab refers to the Christians who were in Iberia at the time of its conquest by Muslims, and in the modern Iberian imaginary, they feigned acceptance of the new dominant culture with the adoption of dress and language, but remained true to the Christian faith, albeit to a variant of the faith espoused by the Roman Catholic Church. In this reformulation, the author denies altogether any possibility of Madragana's Muslimness and or enslavement and or Blackness, traits clearly unacceptable in a king's sexual partner from the vista of the 19th century. This ongoing revision of Madragana's status in order to create as much possible distance from the intellectual and social realm of Mora reflects changing attitudes towards Muslimness, slavery, and even Blackness, and its proper relation to an institution of power and authority, monarchy. This compulsion to counteract membership in another religious community confirms what other historians have shown, that Muslims could be and were seen as inferior in a hierarchical relationship to Christians in the Middle Ages. That conversion comes into play in these chroniclers' accounts recalls the words of Geraldine Hay, that, quote, religious race as a project of improvement would thus be capped at the end by the successful entry of the convert into a new racial religious formation, end quote. None of the other Christian concubines of medieval Iberian kings that form part of my dissertation, and certainly none of Alfonso III's other concubines, have undergone such extensive, reiterating revisions. The only other medieval concubines subjected to this status revision were women with connections to the Islamic world. A concubine well known among medievalists working on high medieval Iberia is Saira, the late 11th century concubine of Alfonso VI of Castilla, who ruled from 1065 to 1109. Like Madragana, the medieval and early modern chronicles in which Saira appears also rely heavily on indications of nobility and conversion to Christianity in order to render her sexual relationship with the king acceptable and to create distance between Moranes and monarchy. Like Madragana, a 12th century concubine from Portugal's neighboring kingdom, Leon, went from being, quote, a Mora from Salamanca, end quote, in the 14th century Portuguese Livro de Linagem do Conde Dom Pedro, to a Christian woman named Maura from Salamanca, in the 18th century Spanish Memorias de Reinas Católicas de España. These examples smack of antipathy to interracial sex when proximate to an institution of power and authority, when race is seen along religious lines. But was there more to Mora than religious race? I have thus far avoided parsing the category Mora, and it is to that endeavor that I now turn. By and large, more is currently taken by scholars to be a wholly unstable term, one weighed down by centuries of accretions that allow for interpretations not warranted by the sources. But the evidence suggests that moro, more, is the site of intersection between ideas of religious race and biological. To demonstrate my thinking on this, I will first offer a schematic of why more is considered a problematic category when discussing the variegations of the medieval Iberian world, before arguing that such a dismissal has pre-modern and modern ramifications. In the process, I will ask why many historians, despite working on a region well known for its multicultural, multi-confessional, and multi-ethnic society, and thus rich in possibility for questions about race thinking, remain hesitant, perhaps even uneasy, withdrawing on the tools of critical race scholarship to do so. More simply means Muslim, it is often said, but this is a convenient, even prophylactic response that allows scholars to wriggle out of the burden of interrogating the race thinking that underlies this term. Some may be familiar with the late antique and early medieval uses of Maurus by the Romans to describe those from Mauritania or North Africa, a use seen in Isidore of Seville. But my primary focus here is on its medieval usage, and I offer the term's genealogy as recently articulated by well-known scholar of the medieval Mediterranean, Yujhán Claros. Quote, it originated in the 8th century encounter between people of the Iberian Peninsula and the Arabo-Islamic conquest and worked more in terms of ethnicity, as the conquerors were split into Maori and Arabs. Later on, Maurus became the Castilian Moro and became a synonym for Muslim while carrying the ethnic connotation of foreigner, end quote. Catlas attributes a transformation of moro into more with racial connotations to English historiography, i.e. Blackamoor, which assimilated other baggage and fed the romanticization of a period of Iberian history. And he dismisses the category altogether as, quote, a not so innocent distortion, end quote. In other scholarship, one finds the definition more means Berber, a word with its own not so innocent uses, whether that be its ties to the Roman descriptor for barbarians, the use of this group as the scapegoat for the end of the caliphate in Arab historiography, or the more insidious line drawn by scholars like Maria Rosa Menokal between the underlying Europeanness of urbane and sophisticated Arab Al-Andalus and the fanaticism and foreignness of the two Berber dynastic empires, the Almoravids and the Almohads. But rather than dismiss either of these terms as simply too complex to engage, I will focus on their underlying assumptions to show that they are a place where religious race and biological race intersect and are therefore worthwhile to linger on. If Maurus Moro entered the Iberian lexicon at the time of the 8th century conquest as a means of distinguishing the ethnic groups of the conquerors, Arab and non-Arab, then it can be said to mean Berber. But as Michael Brett and more recently Ramsey Royde have shown, Berber itself was also a term invented in the 8th century, but by Arabs, to classify the non-Arab, non-Roman, non-Byzantine populations of North Africa that converted to Islam. So Moro did mean Muslim, but it meant a very specific set of Muslims. Moro equals Berber equals non-Arab, non-Roman, non-Byzantine, North African Muslims. The African connotation of Berber is a problem for scholars. It seems to be the potential blackness signified by the category that is. And this is exactly why the term is important. Moro could function as a color signifier, one that signified a whole range of skin tones. So what should scholars do with this term? I argue that the translation of the term Moro should vary over time in order to reflect both the changing Andalusi Muslim population and the accompanying change in the term's connotations. When Muslims conquered the Iberian Peninsula in the early 8th century, the Arabs were the minority, with the majority of the forces being comprised of Berbers. Over the course of the next several centuries, the Muslim community of Al-Andalus came to include an intermarried blend of Muqaddalun, converts from native Iberian families and their descendants, Arabs of Syrian and Yemeni ancestry, Sakaliba, Slavs, that is those of European origin, brought to Iberia as slaves at a young age, along with their descendants, and Berbers from North Africa, a group comprised not just of the descendants of the original conquering forces, but also periodic replenishments from the regularly employed Berber auxiliary forces, as well as the arrival of two Berber dynastic empires in the 11th and 12th centuries, the Almoravids and the Almohads. It therefore makes sense to translate Moro in these early centuries as African Muslim, with the understanding that non-Arab Africanness, pre-modern as much as modern, exists as a spectrum of hues and phenotypes, not just those associated with sub-Saharan Africans or North African opposite. By the time of the last Christian conquest at the close of the 15th century, the majority of the Muslim population in Iberia were the descendants of native converts, with a significantly smaller group being the descendants of the other three groups who did not leave Iberia for other parts of the Islamic Mediterranean as the wave of Christian colonization pushed further south. In this sense, it can be said that in late medieval Iberia, most of the Muslims phenotypically resembled their Christian counterparts. The 15th and 16th centuries were also when the slave trade and sub-Saharan Africans began to spread across the Iberian Peninsula, and the term Moro Negro began to appear in sources. Thus, in late medieval Iberia, it makes sense to translate Moro as Muslim and Moro Negro as dark-skinned Muslim, a distinction mirrored in the common historiographic juxtaposition between Muslims and Black Africans. The willingness to discard Moro and the ways in which it reveals changing connections between religious race and biological race facilitate exactly the kinds of claims that many historians declare themselves to be fighting against. The use of the medieval past to vindicate modern fantasies about who is, and who manifestly is not, able to claim belonging in Iberia or the medieval world more broadly. Perhaps the reason that certain scholars of medieval Iberian studies find critical race scholarship out of place is because they are uncomfortable grappling with the accompanying ethical, political, and epistemological consequences and impacts of certain parts of the medieval Iberian past, particularly those like Moor, which accrued various forms of baggage in the intervening centuries. But for someone like me, a Black woman whose presence in archives, at conferences, and in other institutional sites for the production of knowledge generates all manner of discomfort, disbelief, disingenuity, and disses of an altogether more vitriolic nature, there can be no such sidestep. Indeed, the enduring legacy of the linkage between biological race and religious race in Iberia has been made viscerally clear to me while on my Fulbright scholarship in Spain. Never before have I been stopped by strangers on the street or sitting in a park to be interrogated about whether or not I am Muslim, simply on the basis of my appearance. Even so, any potential Blackness in the Iberian past has been systematically denied. While living in Madrid, I had the opportunity to talk with Black Spaniards whose parents or grandparents were immigrants from places like Equatorial Guinea or Cuba. They were never taught that in any period of Spanish history, Black people were present in, much less contributors to, Spanish culture. I learned from colleagues among the Fulbright English teaching assistants of the absence of Islamic pre-modern history more broadly in Spanish public schools. Much of the variegations of pre-modern Iberian history had been collapsed into palatable narratives, just as medieval history in America, if taught at all in public schools, is contracted to England, France, and maybe Germany, by portraying Black people, or even Muslims of other ethnic groups, as perpetual newcomers. The integrity of the white Christian medieval Spanish past is preserved. Where was a unit on Alfonso X's practice of vocation in Toledo that attempted to wrest Andalusia rap and be heard in the sound and seen in the movement of something so quintessentially Spanish as flamenco? These are, to be sure, multifaceted issues that require critical thinking, and some historians and educators have determined them simply too complex to present to learners of different ages. But an unwillingness to grapple with slipperiness in formative moments has real consequences, one which my Blackness has not permitted me to find shelter from. This is why I helped my English teaching assistant colleagues to develop age-appropriate lessons on such issues, and why my comments today take seriously what critical race scholarship has to offer those working on pre-modern Iberia, in a corner of the medieval world where I see the possibility such an approach might offer. By way of closing, let me return to Bridgerton and to the British monarchy. In 1956, shortly after Queen Elizabeth II's accession, the Apology of Blood Royal, written by Sir Rupert Ian K. Moncrieff and Don Pottinger, cited Saida, the aforementioned Mora concubine of Alfonso VI of Castilla, as the source of Queen Elizabeth II's genealogical connection to the Prophet Muhammad, and thus justifying Elizabeth's right to rule over Muslims in the Commonwealth. In this modern example, medieval religious race is biologized in order to render it the rightful inheritance of a modern, white, Christian monarch in need of justification for ongoing colonial rule. Contrast this lauding of a distant genealogical connection, at least 19 generations, with a ridicule directed at the connection between Madrigana and Queen Charlotte, a mere 15 generations. Here we see a contradiction characteristic of the white supremacist fantasy. Royal biological Muslimness is perfectly acceptable if vested in a white body, because it is palatable in its containability. But if at any point it is carried within a Black body, it must be derided to refuse its destabilizing potentiality. A similar dynamic exists in the dismissal of the term Moor, because of its underlying connections to non-Arab Africa, a continent peopled by those of Black skin. It is dismissed in favor of a less complex term, Muslim, because for most it carries the more white proximate connotation, Arab. So, Saida was a Muslim of the most noble Arab lineage, so that Elizabeth can rule over Muslims. But Madrigana couldn't have been a Mora with connections to non-Arab Africa, because Charlotte couldn't possibly have had African ancestry. Let me return to a question posed recently by the former co-editor of a British peerage publication cited above. Who cares? At least one answer can be found in a revised reading of Bridgerton. Its flaws aside, and to be sure, there are many. By casting a Black woman as Queen Charlotte in contravention of the intricacies of a historical record, alongside a cast full of characters that capture the range and hues of Blackness, Bridgerton confronts head-on the refusal of Black presence throughout history, especially places that are constructed to be the preserve of whiteness. Today, I, a Black woman studying medieval Iberian concubinage, have confronted the refusal to see race thinking throughout history and within historiography, especially places that are constructed to be the preserve of white scholars. In the words of Bridgerton's Queen Charlotte, while you may be content to accept defeat, that is certainly not how I approach things. Thank you.
So thanks to all three panelists. And we're now going to go into sort of panel mode. And I think I'm going to start, even though there are some questions in Q&A already, by asking if the panelists have questions that they might want to talk to each other about. So I'm just going to open that up to any of the three panelists.
This question's for Stacey, and it's a totally different time period. But when I was looking at the maps of Iberia that you had throughout time, it made me think about Punic Iberia, right, when it was controlled by Carthage, and traditions in the Hebrew scriptures that would situate the Iberian Peninsula as like the kingdom of, or the land of Tarshish. Like this idea that there have been these Semitic and African peoples, Semitic African mixture, right, in Iberia as far back as the late antiquity. Is that something that you see taught in Spain, or is that also completely disappeared and erased?
That is absolutely disappeared and erased. That's why this narrative of the Mos Arabs, so like of essentially Visigoths who are imagined as this idealized like sort of white race, are essentially Iberian history writ large, in a way that's sort of like they pretended to speak Arabic, they pretended to wear these clothes, but really they were just staying true, and it's very, very reduced in that sense.
So I'm just thinking about that connection that both Yujhán and Stacey were making in relation to thinking about Yujhán's reference to Morrison and the Africanist kind of discussion, but also what Stacey is sort of showing in that kind of genealogy of taking the term and sort of seeing, what is going on with the lexicography through the history, the both kind of wrapping it in Africanness, but then also like later on attempting to kind of whiten the whole thing. And if either of you want to talk about that, but also the fact that it's so interesting that in Stacey and Jennifer's talks, you guys are talking about the same period at a certain juncture, right? And in this moment about late medieval Iberia, but this is like it's almost like two ships crossing, right? That they're, even as we are thinking about that early history of transatlantic chattel slavery, it's sort of shocking to imagine that the history of Iberia writ large in the schools, and I'm not even, and where this is being taught in Iberia is kind of completely erased so many things. So if anyone wants to talk about that.
I will just, I think that it's really fascinating the way that Stacey's work and my work is, Dorothy, I think the way you just said it is perfect. It's like we're working at least in part in the same place, but they're two completely different historiographies and two completely different kind of critical interventions that we're making. And so I actually don't have questions for either of my co-panelists, just because I'm learning so much from them. But I think that one of the things that Stacey's work makes me think about is the way that the scholarship on slavery and religion and race indifference in Iberia it's moving in a direction, but so many of us who call ourselves Atlanticists are not taking up the Iberian experience with any kind of depth. I mean, I feel like I'm trying to do so myself, but clearly I have missed I've missed some important questions. So I do think that there's a historiographical divide that is that's unfortunate for those of us who think of ourselves as Black Atlanticists.
Yeah, when I was listening to you talk and I heard you quote from the Chronicle, and he said the word "more" when he went to Senegal, my ears immediately were like, oh my goodness, like it's such an interesting way that a word can move in so many different directions and across time. And I think that's one of the beauties of Race Before Race, is because it's bringing people over, who work in very different disciplines or who work in different chronologies to come together, because often people think, I will start, the transatlantic slave trade in the middle of the 15th century without thinking about the relationship to Blackness and enslavement in a medieval context and the way in which that informs really everything going forward. And so for me, I think what's really interesting is that they keep coming back to the same descriptors and same words. And so that is sort of a fault line for them. They need this thing to be what reflects how they view it. And its translations, of course, cause plenty of issues, but.
All right, I'm going to open it up to questions then in the Q&A. And the first question is from Vanessa Stovall. Question for Yujhán: does reflection play a role in your research? And if so, how? This is fairly broad and I'm open to any interpretation that you have. Some areas my mind went, while I agree that veils and being kept indoors are logical conclusions to draw around why women are portrayed as pale, I also wonder what the role of cosmetics and makeup could also potentially play, specifically in smoothing women over and making them more reflective to light. I was also thinking of Ava Shirazi's recent work on the ancient bronze mirror and whether having bronze reflections impacted the ancient imaginary in any way. A bit, so if you want to respond to that.
Okay, I have some notes that I've taken on this, so I hope I'm not super scattered in trying to answer this. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that question, and for, again, encouraging me to think about this issue of the cosmetic and the cosmos when it comes to gender. I so appreciate this, this goad from you. So I'll just say that this is not principally like as I said, these are preliminary and concluding arguments. So this is not the main meat of my research. But I will address that in a moment. I think the idea of thinking about the bronze mirror and Ava Shirazi's work is fascinating. So my thought about it is, if there is no makeup, right, then the sex bodies, it's just a blurry shadow that you'll see in the bronze mirror. Just no matter how polished it is, right? You're not going to really be able to see much more than just a vague shape. So I feel like hair shape and white powder makeup would definitely potentially make a difference. But then there's also the consideration of light source, right? Like how reflective could a white dusted face be if inside of a house or by candlelight or firelight. And so I thought about the moment in the majority of my work, I'd say, is oriented toward Hellenistic poetry and especially the Argonautica. And there's this fascinating moment at the middle of the text, like books 1 and 2 are very much male centric, and then books 3 and 4 are totally a feminist text. And so you get this scene with the goddesses, and it's the first time you see the gods in the Argonautica, and Aphrodite is sitting at her, in her halls, and she's doing up her hair. And so the language that gets used there when she's doing her hair is cosme, right? Like the verb is it's really this cosmetic thing that she's doing, and it's also organizing of the cosmos. And then later on, when she gives the spherical ball to her son Eros, I think there's definitely this sense that it's been discussed how there's a cosmic dimension to that spherical ball that she gives him. So I think that thinking about this issue of the cosmetic and the cosmos is really important. So yeah, tangentially, that's the best I can do to think about the heart and meat of my main research topic. And then I also thought about Narcissus and his reflection, because when he's described in Ovid, the whiteness of Narcissus is really a big deal. So I think that there's reflection, right? I haven't written on this in any formal way, but his reflection is a really big deal. And there are also critical gender and racial issues that are being deployed there as well. So I'm sorry that that's so scattered, but that's a. So another thing is the issue of light and reflection, thinking with Ava again, Shirazi, about these issues of optics. Optic theory is so complicated in Greek thought, and there are so many different ways to think about it, but light source and fire, like that kind of thinking about women's reflections as something that, like, what's the origin of it? Is it related to the light source and the flame? Because then it is that transcribing heat onto the moist, wet body of woman. Yeah.
Jennifer, do you want to go ahead and answer Cord's question?
Sure. So I appreciate the question, because I must have made something less clear than I meant it to be. So what I meant to do in contrasting the description of the captives in Zurara with the passivity that's evoked by the auction block is to emphasize the fact that there is this active refusal of the claim that captives and those being sold were not embedded in families or in kin relationships, right? And so that one of the things that really comes out in that passage, as I know you know, is the fact that people are literally, like, they are being physically put into parcels and they are rushing away from the parcel to reunite with their families, right? So there's a physicality to the refusal, and it's very it's full of movement. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that there isn't that the passivity is something that's constructed by abolitionists in evoking that kind of passive figure on the auction block, but in fact there's an enormous amount of movement involved there. And I guess I'm gonna, if it's okay, Dorothy, I can also reference the other question that was posed to me by Angela Zhang about the kind of poignancy of the denial of kinship in wet nursing. And so I would say that part of what I feel like is so important in the way that racial ideology kind of coheres in this early period is in that tension between a recognition of kin ties and a refusal of it. And I think that you're absolutely right. There's this incredible pathos in severing a woman, like literally and figuratively, from the child that she just gave birth to in order to employ her as a wet nurse, and to do so in a way that is both steeped in the kind of nurturing and affective and nourishment care that woman is providing for the enslaver's child, while simultaneously presuming that she doesn't have those feelings of care or that capacity to care for her own. And I think that it's that tension in the market and kinship that is most important for us to kind of work through.
Thank you. So this is a question from Kim Hall. This question is a bit abstract, but I'm wondering if the speakers would want to comment on the roles of race in conceptions of time and history. Professor Murrell's quoting the idea of the Middle Ages as far distant when it comes to questions of Blackness and royalty bring to mind Professor Betancourt's talk, where the Middle Ages seem to be an accessibly close part for white supremacists, and Professor Stevens' earlier comments about periodization. So feel free, anyone who wants to jump in.
I'll just jump in really quickly. Incredibly generous for someone to call me professor. That's like the dream. I'm still a PhD candidate, but that's a beautiful thing for me to read. So thank you for that. I think it is very much as you've sort of pointed out, Blackness is always constructed as being not close, not proximate, but distant, particularly when things like power and authority are concerned, because the closer it comes, the harder it is to deny history to Black people. So they have to continuously be rendered farther and farther and farther back in time, particularly if that also allows denial of any sort of proximity to modernity or to civilization, broadly construed in the white supremacist fantasy. And I think one of the other reasons for that is because, like I said, if you want to protect this idea of a nation that is, you know, the preserve of white people or whatever it might be. So in Spain, very much this idea of trying to keep the unity of a country, and therefore everyone who's doesn't fit that idea as a perpetual newcomer, their presence has to be pushed farther and farther and farther back in time. And I think that periodization plays a huge role in that, because if you don't teach it, it's really easy for it to seem far away. But the pieces you do teach, like the Crusades, can seem constant and present and always happening. And so that's why they cherry pick what kinds of medieval history to be taught, so that those special, you know, white supremacist proximate notions and images can be really present while everything else is obscured.
Anyone else want to jump in on that question?
It made me think of Scott Manning Stevens' presentation and what he said. He distinguished, and I don't recall exactly, but I think it was he was quoting from a native indigenous writer who was describing the difference between chronology and horology. When I heard him talk about that, it made me think of Paul Chen, the Taiwanese Canadian mural artist who wrote an essay on chirology. And so he opposes chronology to chirology and has this idea that the chirological is this space of possibility, and that art, it has an innate ability to tap into the chirological, to create new forms and envision new worlds and possibilities that is beyond chronology. And to me, it's just salient to think about different ways of ordering time that are possible in these you know, they're realized, but through, as I'm understanding it, a kind of racialized experience of the world.
Then I think I will move to the next question, which is from Josh Hartman, and this is to Stacey. I mentioned this mostly in case it is helpful, but it is surprising to hear that some medievalists deny the racial dimension of the term Morisco, Morisca, since it appears to be an exclusively racial designation in the Sistema de Castas in New Spain. Is this later usage ignored in such arguments or rationalized away somehow?
So I'm really glad for this question, because I was hoping I would get to talk a little bit more about Morisca, because the time in which it appears, at least in the works that I'm looking at, is late 16th century. So it's right before the expulsion of the Moriscos from Spain. And so it's this time when these different usages are really competing in the Iberian Peninsula, because it's coming to be used increasingly, especially to define, you know, the children of European fathers and mixed, you know, either fully African or maybe African and indigenous or African and European women. And so this competition is really interesting, because you see this used for biological race at the same time that it's being used for a descriptor for religious race. And they sort of come to a head in the late 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century. And so most medievalists don't talk about the like New Spain. They don't really talk about what happens after, you know, the encounter between Columbus and the New World. At least most medieval Iberianists sort of cut themselves at 1492, however arbitrary that might be. And those who do are actually really, really nuanced at engaging with those kinds of questions. And so I think it's a historiographic divide between those who refuse to push themselves to look at to cross the boundaries essentially of the medieval and the early modern, and the people who want to remain within those boundaries for various reasons. Certainly that's not to say that there are no medievalists who can acknowledge the relationship between the medieval and early modern pasts of the Iberian world. But for me, I think that's what's really interesting is the usage of Mauricio at this particular time, because again, it's this fault line for different ways of race thinking, especially when it involves miscegenation.
Thank you. This is a question from Lehua. And this is for everyone. All the papers touched on the centrality of variously, not identically, genealogy, descent, kinship, family, within this plethora of terms found in various genres and art forms. How might we both look for and analyze place or displacement as constitutive of these terms, and yet always silenced in modern apprehensions of the relationship terms? I'm thinking of Yujhán's tracing of citizenship, Jennifer's mention of court petitioning, jurisdiction, and Stacey's Morrow map. So whoever wants to go and address that.
I can jump in. I mean, for me, because my work is always about the literal movement of people from the West African coast to the Americas, the way that I mobilize the idea of inheritance or genealogy and kinship is precisely to look at the ways in which it's being forced to change, like it's being changed under duress as a result of the Middle Passage, as a result of sort of layers of slave sale. And one of the things that is really important in the chapter that I drew this talk from is the ways that sales are happening all over in different ways, that they're not like cordoned off in like auction houses or on auction blocks, but they're just a part of the kind of materiality of everyday life for people who are living in these port cities. And so it's always about, I'm always trying to kind of appreciate the way that these concepts of relatedness and inheritance are being both sort of severed and then sutured, I said, like by the Middle Passage and by what happens at the point and at the sites of sale. Thank you for the questions, really generative.
Stacey or Yujhán, do you guys want to like address that, or it's up to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important question, and I wish that I could be, provide something deeper, right? But as I thought about it, I just felt like it was important to say something about how, in looking at the classical past, part of what's been so limiting in terms of just doing the work is the insistence that this is all closed off, right? So Patrice Rankine talked about Martin Bernal and kind of how dramatic his work was in 1987, because he proposed that, well, Greece is Greece because of mixture, and now that idea is not as surprising, even though the work hasn't been done to show exactly what that mixture was. But the idea that the ancient world was interconnected and that boundaries were porous, that people were mixing and traveling, and so were ideas, and that there weren't these, the West was the West and Greece was Greece, and no, people in Greece knew India, people in Greece knew Egypt, they knew Persia, Iran, right? Like the world was not so small and fragmented, and space was bigger than we've allowed ourselves to imagine.
I'll just respond very briefly. The question makes me think of something that Joyce Green McDonald said yesterday when talking about like Black women in Shakespeare, that removal or erasure or displacement is not necessarily or per se a sign of absence. And so I think that really resonates for me when I'm thinking about sort of the displacement of Blackness from a medieval past, particularly in the form of genealogy. and how that the opposite of that is very easy to do. We can easily place these lines of descent where they might be desirable, but the ones that are not desirable have to be removed, even if that doesn't mean that they don't exist. So I'm very, very appreciative of this question, but that is sort of exactly what it leads me to think is, again, the displacement is an absence. And I think that that's something that would be useful for us all to think about going forward when we think that just because it's not there, that it wasn't ever there.
Thank you. So we'll take one last question from Jonathan, and then actually there will be a small set of closing remarks from me and Patricia Akimi. So if people want to stay afterward. This is a question from Jonathan, and I would just add as well, part of the reason I thought of bringing you three together was that really the work really suggested that racial, like pre-modern critical race making and thinking about race, it always intersects with gender. And it's very interesting to see that all of you ended up actually talking about the projects of generation, right? The sort of various ways in which the different periods kind of rethought citizenship, also property, also like who gets to be allowed into this very strange project of monarchy and like royal lineage. And so in relationship to that, if you can think about also intersectionality and gender, Jonathan's question is, I'm curious if anyone has thoughts about how disciplinary structures in North America versus Europe could be bridged to do CRT pre-modern work. Is there a bridge between, say, ethnic studies in North America and migration studies in Europe? And anyone feel free to jump in. I can start. All right. I actually think that this is also why it's so interesting to have the longer time, like the transhistorical conversation and also methodological conversations. I think, I just got the book, and I actually took a picture of it. I just got the book yesterday, right? This is Olivet Hotel's African Europeans, right? And I think about the fact that, the conversation happening there about Black Europeans, about African Europeans is happening slightly later, right? But it is actually a conversation that can go much earlier. And it would be really good to be able to have that kind of like cross discussion and things like that. Anyone else?
I mean, I would say that, so from my experience, and I sort of made a joke about this after Yujhán's presentation, but so in the context of studies of the Atlantic world, the sort of movement back in time from the 19th to the 18th and now to the 17th century, like I feel like that's where the most vibrant part of that field is, to the early modern and then to the medieval, and part of that is happening in spaces in which there's conversation between folks who are working on Europe and folks who are working on the Americas and on Africa. And I think that there is, but it's not so much interdisciplinary as like intradisciplinary, but it feels like it's a place of that it's generative. And I might be a kind of glass half full person in that regard, but it feels like there are more and more critical conversations that are taking place between folks who have in the past been siloed, working just on early America or just on Africa or just on Europe. And so that feels to be at least a space that speaks to the kind of possibility, Dorothy, that you just discussed.
Yujhán, Stacey?
I'll sort of second that in an interdisciplinary way, because much of the work in medieval studies is very siloed. So lots of historians don't do the work of critical race scholarship and deride literary scholars who do, and that's true for early modern as well. And so I think that is a barrier that remains to be broken down, because a lot of really interesting work has been done about race and gender in literature. And that literature doesn't exist in a silo. It's not a vacuum in relationship to the sources historians look at. And so I think that there's this, aside from a chronological and geographical limitation, there is very much a methodological and source-based divide that needs to be bridged. And I, for one, think that it's really, really interesting, in particular, that a lot of historians are willing to engage with, say, Maurice as like, okay, I'll take this as a source, but they don't want to engage Blackness and gender in the sort of sources that they consider historical, which I think is really, really interesting. I don't know why. I have no explanation for that, but I think it is something that would perhaps disappear if medievalists, and particularly medievalists in certain subfields, are more willing to push their limits of their discomfort and to realize that they have a lot to learn from people who are working in proximate disciplines.
Yujhán, do you want to say anything, or it's totally up to you?
Yeah, I was just trying to gather my thoughts, but I think something came together that the inability to take critical race theory, or the lack of willingness or desire to take critical race theory and gender theory seriously in classical studies limits the ability of most classicists to really understand the world that they're studying, even though they've, it's supposed to be an interdisciplinary field in its own creation, right? That it's not just language or philology. It's something that classicists frequently like to say. If you're not taking seriously what the human experience is, and the thinking with Toni Morrison, right? Tell me what it is to be a woman, and I'll tell you what it is to be a man, right? If you're ignoring gender studies and critical race theory and the ways that they operate, that these analytic tools give us these insights that make this world richer and give us a better understanding of it. I can only hope that the disciplinary work will be done to undiscipline us and rediscipline us.
I think it just as a last comment, and then I'll go into my comments, is that it's so interesting because, of course, Saidiya Hartman is actually a literature scholar, but Jessica Marie Johnson is a historian, and so is Marissa Fuentes. Christina Sharp is a literature scholar, right? But it's not as if these methodologies aren't talking to each other, or in fact that this is, a very robust conversation. Catherine McKittrick is in geography, right? So this question of the disciplines and what this divide is that, well, depending on what your frame outs are, there's a conversation happening amongst a whole range of scholars in different disciplines, actually working through really complicated questions about methodology together, right? So it's not as if there isn't examples of this happening. And so that's where I would like to leave it off. And thank you to the panelists for a really amazing set of talks and also conversation. We're going to take a little time over just for some closing comments. And also I'll start, and then Patricia, if you want to put on your video, you can pop into the panel setting. Apologies, I've written this in 3 different locations because basically I've been writing it as panel, like basically all of today, while panels have been happening and things like that. So it is also not exactly linear. I will begin. I'm closing today with some comments and thoughts as a takeaway from Race4Race politics. These are not completely organized into one linear direction, but I hope they leave us with more to think, sustain, discuss. Our fields research, write, practice white supremacist methodologies. This is why we say burn it down. Pre-modern critical race studies is about how race is biopolitical and sociocultural. This means that we are in discussions with contemporary critical race theory that is currently in the material turn of theory. My own preferred genealogy of this discussion weaves between Hortense Spillers, Sylvia Winters, Catherine McKittrick, Alexander Wahilea, Jasper Poir, Michael Jaimes Garcia, Maria Lugones. Critical race studies has been discussing the material turn and race as biopolitical and sociocultural for a long time. Even now, as politics globally, both in North America with the attacks on critical race theory, and in Europe with the comments of Macron in France and the Sewell report in the UK, we are seeing the backlash to see the past with critical race theory as not an ecosystem, what I have discussed in a recently published piece as white heritage as politics. This is both thinking through Daniel Christmas's work on the term heritage politics, but also Cheryl Harris's foundational piece in critical race theory, Whiteness is Property. White heritage as politics is about white supremacist architectural lived environments that Lyra Montero has discussed. It is about what I would call the blood manuscripts, like the blood diamonds or blood sugar that Lubaba Al-Azami discussed in examining the Sloan collection. About so many of our painful, often threatening experiences in the archives themselves. Or what Stacey Murrell discusses in the sort of oppositional logic relations that Cheryl Harris discusses to the one drop or blood quantum formulations, and how conversion may actually kind of rethink some of these things. In addition, I think this conference has really showed how much the conversation in some of the foundational pieces in CRT, all coming from legal studies, undergird our discussions. Along with Cheryl Harris's Whiteness is Property, all our fields have been have seen the practice of what Sumi Cho describes in post-racialism. The valorization of colorblindness and individual morality, this particular canard now in line with every far-right pundit, conservative talk show host, and white supremacist Republican policymaker trying desperately to ban CRT. The deflection of discussing race by going to class, and the ad hominem or ad feminam used as moral equivalents rather than to address the issues at hand. Likewise, I see this conference moving through the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and the Combahee River Collective by situating the terrain and shape of a compelling pre-modern archive in relationship to intersectionality, how the framework of compounded harm both helps us rethink this archive, but also shifts from the legal structure seen in US law. Many of these talks discuss how the field has disciplined us, continues to discipline us, has enacted violence towards those we see as kin, and as us as scholars and students in this disciplining. I say, and I would say Race4Race as a collective would say, fuck that. Linda Tuhaui Smith writes in Decolonizing Methodologies, quote, from the vantage point of the colonized, a position from which I write and choose to privilege, the term research is inextricably linked to European imperialism and colonialism. The word itself, research, is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary. When mentioned in many Indigenous contexts, it stirs up silence, it conjures up bad memories. It raises a smile that is knowing and distrustful. It is so powerful that Indigenous people even write poetry about it, about research, unquote. Research is white violence, and it is a form of intellectual terror. Though, as Joyce McDonald explained in her Q&A, we do this work because it is our duty. And I would like to think now about duty of care as a way to discuss what else I have seen at this conference. So I began my opening remarks by discussing respect, reciprocity, relations. These three R's are a tenet in Indigenous studies in relationship to Indigenous methodology. I would like to return to these to think about how we resituate methodology as we practice what Walter Mignolo has described as epistemic disobedience. For example, philology, this long white supremacist spiderweb of violent terrorism that is wielded like a knife or lash that leaves a bloody, vicious trail in the wake. A Black feminist dictionary is a lexicographic counter-narrative. It is a way to resist, but also to try to repair the experience Audre Lorde writes about philology as a disciplining, a white supremacist disciplining. A resistant philology, ancient forms of intersectionality that constitute the intertwined categories of racial, gender, sexuality, and its differences, is what Claros discussed in his talk. And then the complexities of how this expresses biopolitically in epidermal race. His gestures to the work of the material turn in both race, gender, and sexuality. And Stacey Murrell's also kind of rethinking the philology of clearly race terms is a kind of counter narrative to this kind of the kind of violence of philology. To rethink temporalities as a local situated phenomenon attuned to place and relational situatedness is a form of decolonized historical methodology. It means that we can tell the story of time, namely history, as a relation story of our kin. To ask our kin to tell the stories to teach our languages, or to ask our students to tell the story of architectural discipline and its white supremacist frames. And then to think finally of methodologies and relationality of knowledge rather than ancestry, stemma, knowledge as genetic inheritance or origins as a kind of paterfamilias, working back to an originary father as white heritage. Instead, I think this conference lets us think about what we have discussed as linking and holding kin, that the relations and reciprocity of kin is a way to reject the white supremacist epistematic violence of our fields. And so in this way, I'm thinking back to Christina Sharp's work and this quote, that is, our knowledge of slavery and Black being in slavery is gained from our studies, yes, but also in excess of those studies. It is gained through the kinds of knowledge from and of the everyday, from what Dion Brand calls, quote, sitting in the room with history, unquote. We are expected to discard, discount, disregard, jettison, abandon, and measure those ways of knowing and to enact epistemic violence that we know to be violence against others and ourselves. In other words, for Black academics to produce legible work in the academy often means adhering to research methods that are drafted into the service of larger destructive force, thereby doing violence to our own capacities to read, think, and imagine otherwise. Despite knowing otherwise, we are often disciplined into thinking through and along lines that reinscribe our own annihilation, reinforcing and reproducing what Sylvia Wynter has called our, quote, narratively condemned status, unquote. We must become undisciplined. The work we do requires new modes and methods of research and teaching, new ways of entering and leaving the archive of slavery, of undoing the, quote, racial calculus and political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago, unquote. So finally, I would just like to leave off by saying, I think it is time to rethink kin. It is time to link together as kin. And I think it's time to sit with community. And this is really what we've been trying to do in this collective and at this conference. So thank you everyone for joining us. And now I'm gonna head it over to Patricia.
And I'll pick up on that thread by thanking you all for joining us in this conversation, which is an ongoing conversation. And that's one of the things I value most about Race Before Race. Perhaps some of you were here with us in January when we talked about education and returned for the continuation of that conversation. And I hope many of you will join us as the conversation continues as at the next installment of Race Before Race, which will happen at Rutgers University and co-hosted by the Folger Shakespeare Library. The topic for the next installment will be region and enmity. And it will be fully virtual and registration will open in August. So look for it in your inboxes and I'll see you there October 19th through 22nd. Bye, everybody.
Thanks everyone for coming. It's good to see everyone and we'll see you next time.